We're going to begin with the intensifying military conflict, which has spiraled into a full-blown regional war, raising major questions about how long U.S. combat operations will last and whether it will require U.S. boots on the ground. Right now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Kane, are all on Capitol Hill, briefing congressional leaders behind closed doors. We're going to keep a close eye on what lawmakers are saying after they are briefed. Now, moments ago, though, we did hear from Secretary of State Rubio, who emphasized the administration's position as to why these strikes had to happen now, and the explicit purpose of this mission is to destroy Iran's ballistic missile capabilities.
The purpose of this is to destroy that missile capability. Why does Iran want that ballistic missile capability? What they are trying to do and have been trying to do for a very long time is build a conventional weapons capability as a shield where they can hide behind, meaning there would come a point where they have so many conventional missiles, so many drones, and it can inflict so much damage that no one can do anything about their nuclear program. That is what they were trying to do, is put themselves in a place of immunity where the damage they could inflict on the region would be so high that no one can do anything about their nuclear program or their nuclear ambitions.
Now, already the U.S. and Israeli strikes have pounded Iran's military infrastructure, taking out Iran's supreme leader, along with multiple senior Iranian leaders. At least 4 American service members have died. President Trump telling CNN, quote, "We haven't even started hitting Iran hard. The biggest wave hasn't even happened. The big one is coming soon." The president also addressing the war at a Medal of Honor ceremony at the White House today, laying out his military goals and notably not ruling out the possibility of a protracted conflict.
Our objectives are clear. First, we're destroying Iran's missile capabilities, and you see that happening on an hourly basis, and their capacity to produce brand new ones, and pretty good ones they make. Second, we're annihilating their Navy. We've knocked out already 10 ships. They're at the bottom of the sea. Third, we're ensuring that the world's #1 sponsor of terror can never obtain a nuclear weapon. And finally, we're ensuring that the Iranian regime cannot continue to arm, fund, and direct terrorist armies outside of their borders. We're already substantially ahead of our time projections, but whatever the time is, it's okay. Whatever it takes, we will always, and we have right from the beginning, we projected 4 to 5 weeks, but we have capability to go far longer than that.
Now, this all comes as Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said this morning that the U.S. will not be engaged in an endless war. Take a listen.
We set the terms of this war from start to finish. Our ambitions are not utopian. They are realistic, scoped to our interests and the defense of our people and our allies. Speaking of people, we hope the Iranian people take advantage of this incredible opportunity. President Trump has been clear, now is your time. This is not Iraq. This is not endless. I was there for both. Our generation knows better, and so does this president. He called the last 20 years of nation-building wars dumb, and he's right. This is the opposite.
But as questions swirl over why the administration decided to take these actions at this time, especially in the midst of an ongoing nuclear talk, and after last summer's strikes, quote-unquote, obliterated Iran's nuclear facilities, per the White House, President Trump and Defense Secretary Hegseth today suggesting Iran posed an imminent threat.
An Iranian regime armed with long-range missiles and nuclear weapons would be an intolerable threat to the Middle East, but also to the American people. Our country itself would be under threat, and it was very nearly under threat.
Iran was building powerful missiles and drones to create a conventional shield for their nuclear blackmail ambitions. Let me say that again. A conventional shield for their nuclear blackmail ambitions. Our bases, our people, our allies, all in their crosshairs. Iran had a conventional gun to our head as they tried to lie their way to a nuclear bomb.
Notably, the president and the defense secretary also not ruling out the possibility of U.S. boots on the ground as this war continues to escalate, with Defense Secretary Hegseth saying, quote, "We'll go as far as we need to go," and President Trump telling the New York Post, quote, "I don't have the yips with respect to boots on the ground, like every president says. There will be no boots on the ground. I don't say it. I say probably don't need them, or if they were necessary." Despite the rhetoric out of the administration, the images on the ground throughout the region have been striking, showing scenes of chaos as Iran carries out a wave of retaliatory strikes against several countries across the region, including Qatar, Dubai, Israel, and Bahrain. Joining me now is our team of reporters, NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube, NBC News international correspondent Matt Bradley is in Tel Aviv, and also with me, NBC News chief international correspondent Keir Simmons. So let's start on the North Lawn. Monica, we just heard from Secretary of State Rubio. He is at the Capitol now briefing the Gang of Eight and an extended group of Capitol Hill leaders. What more are we learning about the president's decision-making when it comes to launching this military operation?
Well, it was notable, Ryan, just now in fielding those questions from reporters. Secretary Rubio sort of seemed to try to clarify some of the confusion that he acknowledged there has been around this question of a possible imminent threat that led the president ultimately to order Operation Epic Fury more than 60 hours ago. And that is, he says, intelligence that suggested that if Iran was attacked by Israel, perhaps, and then they decided to retaliate, Iran decided to retaliate, that threat to U.S. Interests, to military assets, to U.S. service members in the region would be so high that there would be a level, according to Secretary Rubio, of mass casualties, that is what led the president ultimately to hit the green light and say this needed to be done in a more preemptive fashion, because it was unclear and there were sort of competing accounts of what that imminent threat had been, whether it was something that Iran was preparing to do itself, or whether now, as Secretary Rubio seems to be explaining, it would be in the form of some potential retaliation again for a strike that he says the U.S. was aware of. So we are getting a few more details, Ryan, about how that all happened. The president ultimately said he wanted to go forward with this military action when he was on Air Force One on Friday, traveling to Texas, where he gave a speech focused on energy in Corpus Christi. And then, of course, it was later that night into the early hours of Saturday morning when the bombs actually started to fall in conjunction with Israel. But you laid out a lot of questions that are still completely unknown at this time in terms of the timeline. We're getting a little bit more indication. But this other major question of whether there could be U.S. troops on the ground is also a very persistent question I'm sure lawmakers will have as those briefers from the administration get ready to speak with them. Here's a little bit more of what Secretary Rubio had to say on that.
Do you anticipate putting troops on the ground, and how long do you anticipate the conflict to last?
Well, we don't. Let me say two things about it. Number one, the president always has the options to undertake whatever operations he decides to do as the commander-in-chief. That said, we believe the objective that we have set for this mission, which is the destruction of their ballistic missile capabilities, both launch capability and manufacturing, can be achieved without ground forces. Right now, we're not postured for ground forces, but obviously the president has those options. He's never going to rule out anything. But right now, our focus is on the destruction of their ballistic missile launchers, their ballistic missile stockpiles, and their ballistic missile manufacturing capability, as well as their one-way attract drones and their Navy, because of the threat it poses to global shipping.
So Secretary Rubio saying there, Ryan, that the U.S. is not postured for ground troops, but the president not ruling it out, saying if necessary, he might need to do that. Okay.
And then, Monica, obviously this forces the administration to adjust its diplomatic presence to a certain degree in the region. How have they done that amid this military escalation?
Yeah, and you're seeing security alerts from many different embassies in the region, certainly with an elevated risk, with an elevated level. There are many dozens of personnel that have been evacuated, that have basically left their posts for now, given that. And then you are continuing to see these conversations about how that may shift. Remember, Secretary Rubio a couple of days ago thought they had signaled he was going to be traveling to the region, to Israel, today and tomorrow. Obviously, that is not the case as they continue to monitor the many developments coming out of there. Ryan.
Okay, Monica Alba at the White House. Monica, thank you for that. Let's bring in Courtney Kube now, who was in the room during Secretary Hegseth's briefing. And Courtney, there's going to be a lot of talk about the human capital that could be lost as a result of this conflict. And we're learning that even more American service members have died. What can you update us on?
Yeah, we know almost nothing. This has literally happened in the last minute that we found out that there have been now 6 U.S. service members who've been killed. So we know about this one strike that occurred early on. It was the first sort of wave of Iranian retaliation strikes that occurred in Kuwait, where there were 3 individuals, 3 U.S. service members who were killed. A 4th one has now succumbed to his or her injuries. And then there were a number of other serious injuries. We know also that there are now at least 18 individual service members across the region who have been seriously wounded in these Iranian retaliations. And now, as I said, we have 6 individuals who were killed as well. We'll work on more details on that, but we literally just learned this. Okay, so let's talk more about the Pentagon's perspective on this. Are they giving any sort of timeline as to how long this could take? No, and you know, it's a fair question to be asking about a timeline, but the reality is when you're talking about a military mission, unless it's something like Midnight Hammer, where it is sort of a one and done, right? You had these very distinct targets leading up to the nuclear facilities, then you have the facilities themselves. That's not the case. We just heard from Marco Rubio, and we've been hearing from the president, frankly, in these social media videos, that the goal here is to take out their entire ballistic missile program. Well, it is dispersed around the country. We're not just talking about the launchers, we're talking about the stockpiles, we're talking about the production facilities. Some of those are in hardened underground bunkers. That is a big undertaking in and of itself. And I suspect the reason that President Trump keeps talking about 4 to 5 week projection here is because when the military presented him with what are a somewhat finite number of targets here, right, to go after the missile program, to go after the Iranian Navy, they said, we believe that we can destroy all of these targets within 4 to 5 weeks. The problem with that is sometimes you move a lot faster than that. Sometimes they're able to take out, you know, fewer munitions, fewer runs on each one. Other times you don't. You get a battle damage assessment about a facility and you realize we have to go back and hit that again. So I suspect that's why we aren't getting a real sense of the timeline here. Also, of course, no one wants to box the president in. But the reality is there are times where President Trump just puts these things out right in plain sight for us to see. The 4 to 5 weeks he's talking about didn't come out of nowhere. Yeah. So I imagine that was one of the original projections that he got here. And then the question is, are they going to add additional missions or objectives to this? That's another question. We did bring this up in the briefing today, and it got somewhat contentious with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. We specifically asked him about the president's comments of this 4-week timeline, and here's a little what he had to say.
I heard the question about 4 weeks. It's the typical NBC sort of gotcha type question. President Trump has all the latitude in the world to talk about how long it may or may not take. 4 weeks, 2 weeks, 6 weeks. It could move up. It could move back. We're going to execute at his command the objectives we've set out to achieve.
Not sure what was gotcha about a very simple, straightforward question about the timeline, but
a quote from the president.
Right. Yeah. Yes. I mean, but does it give us any insight into perhaps the fact that there is a degree of uncertainty as to how long this could take?
And in fairness, that's military operations. You know, I mean, there's a phrase that no operation ever survives first contact. And so in fairness, it is almost impossible to be able to project the amount of time that an operation will take. Again, especially one that it's complex. You know, they have to start with the air defense systems and sort of pave a way so that they can bring in the bombers and the manned aircraft. And we don't really know. President Trump was talking about this next big phase that's going to come. We don't really know what that is going to encompass, but presumably it will mean more strikes further inside the country with manned aircraft, and that's why he talked about it as this big wave.
Okay, Courtney, thank you for that. Nice job in the briefing room today. Thanks. Getting the answers to those very important questions. Let's go now to Israel, which of course is playing a major role in this operation. Matt Bradley is standing by in Tel Aviv. Matt, we've heard the Trump administration say that this could last weeks, maybe even longer. Does Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government share that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, more or less, Ryan. I mean, what we've been hearing from Netanyahu and some other senior military officials is that this could be a long trial. There could be sacrifices. This could be a major ordeal for the Israeli people. They have stopped short of putting, you know, numbers on it or putting timelines on it like weeks or days or anything like that. And to Courtney's point, I mean, this is basically because they don't know any more than the Trump administration would know. This is going to be a complicated operation and one that the Israelis are you know, going to be trying to execute from a much closer proximity than the U.S. is doing, and with a large level of intelligence, but they're still not able to evaluate how long this is going to take.
And we're showing a video of attacks on Tel Aviv from over the weekend. We know that Israel and Hezbollah have also been exchanging fire. Does it seem at this point that Israel has the capacity to defend against what could be a multi-front war?
Yeah, well, we definitely know that Israel has the capacity to execute a multi-front war because they've been doing it for the past 2 years, and in fact doing it at a much higher level than they're doing it now. There are no real ground operations in this effort, so that really frees up a lot of soldiers. That was the real challenge before, when they were fighting both in Lebanon and in the Gaza Strip, with huge military operations in the West Bank and the threats of war looming elsewhere. So Israel can definitely handle it. The question is, for how long? Over the past 2 years, those wars that I was describing, multiple theaters, put a massive strain on Israel's capacity to fight, on the soldiers who, many of whom are reservists who have been called in just for the occasion. So, as I mentioned, this fight with Iran, it's not as labor intensive as what was going on in the Gaza Strip or the ground invasion in Lebanon. For that reason, it's not a ground invasion, or not yet. So while it is taking a lot of that missile repelling capacity, and that really could be a constraint, maybe even sooner rather than later, the idea of soldiers fighting, of calling up reservists, which have been such a problem in the past here, that might not come up again if this all gets wrapped up in a bow, as the Trump administration and others are hoping it will be.
Okay, Matt Bradley, thank you for that. Let's go to Keir now. Matt talks about this being all wrapped up in a tidy bow, Keir, but you're taking a look at how it's affecting the region beyond just Israel, and the fact that this war and the effects of Iran's retaliation are being felt in other countries like UAE and Bahrain. What's the sense there? How are the nerves in these other countries that are kind of caught up in this conflict?
It's been nervous. It's been a difficult few days. I will say Dubai, you can see behind me there, is defiant, getting flights started again tonight, even just hours after Shahed drones were flying across this city, missiles. I will just answer a question, Ryan, that you've been asking the other folks there with two pieces of sound I want to play you, to this question of who's dominating this war and how are they trying to dominate it, how are they trying to win, and then also how long is it going to take. The first one is from a former commander in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Iranian fighting force, if you like. So he's very close. We spoke to him from Tehran. He's very close to the Iranian government. And I put to him the idea, as President Trump says, that they've knocked out so much leadership, it's going to be hard for them to replace Ayatollah Khamenei, who was killed, obviously, over the weekend and was the supreme leader of Iran. And he was scathing about that notion. Take a listen.
Very easy, because we have a lot of member of this council is maybe suitable for the instead of the Supreme League.
Now, of course, he would say that, wouldn't he? However, it does point to what's happening here, which is that both sides are trying to control this, trying to get the upper hand, and that's really what trying to win a war is about. And on the American side, they are nowhere near done yet. And I can tell you that not from the Americans, but from someone who basically is an independent observer. I got the chance today to talk to Rafael Grossi, who is the head of the Atomic Agency, and the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I asked him about what he's seeing on the ground in Iran. And interestingly, he told me that as far as he can see, the pounding of Iran hasn't even got to the nuclear program yet. Take a listen.
We have seen since Saturday morning that the targets are not necessarily or mainly the nuclear facilities.
So two conclusions, Ryan. One, that both sides are battling in this war to get the upper hand. Two, that it's nowhere near over yet.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.